And now we're moving to our third presenter. That's Annu Dahiya from City University of New York. We can see you.
Perfect.
We can hear you.
Perfect. I'm gonna be sharing my screen as well, so let me just set that up. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm already seeing a lot of really interesting points of resonance between the papers that have already been given and mine. My name is Annu Dahiya, and I am a doctoral lecturer of philosophy at the City University of New York. Briefly speaking, I work within the fields of feminist philosophy of science, 20th century continental thought, and in the last few years, anti-colonial philosophy as well. And my talk today is called Feminist Philosophy and the Origins of Life. So I'm just going to leave this image up. I will explain it later. It's one of my favorite images that relates to my research. So I'll come back to it, but I'll leave it up. Okay, so this talk argues that a feminist philosophy of birth can help us understand the origins of cellular life itself, and thereby provide an alternative to a philosophy of death that I think paradoxically undergirds scientific research about the origins of life. When concepts that have long been explored in feminist philosophy, such as embodiment, gestation, and birth, frame and guide origins research, we come closer to understanding how cellular life may have first emerged. Which I also just want to foreshadow or foreground that I've always been fascinated on the question of life, on the question of where do we come from, and that's what brought me to thinking about origins of life research. I wrote my dissertation on that in feminist philosophy a few years ago. And origins of life research, the whole field is inherently speculative. There are no direct fossils from 4 billion years ago about how cellular life first began. And so it's a kind of impossible question about where did cellular life came from, because there's no quote unquote direct proof. But to me, that's what makes it such an interesting philosophical question as well. So in this talk, I outline how the emergence of cellular life began with single-celled organisms, and that although these organisms reproduced asexually once they had already emerged, I'm going to walk us through some scientific research that argues that the concept of a womb in certain strands of origins of life research is evoked to understand cellular life's initial emergence from matter. I'll share how actually a lot of research about life's central origins, about origins of life research, actually I would argue exists within a framework of death. And I'll show how a concept of womb actually moves us out of a framework of death to a framework of life. In my project, I also, similar to the previous talk, I displaced the human in the philosophy of birth I offer, arguing that we as a species did not invent birth, and because of this, a feminist philosophy of birth should not begin within a human frame. And in my talk, I also am going to explore how a concept called diaphysis, a concept coined by Lucy Irigaray, can help us think about this question about how life began and how a diaphysis is different from what we call a metaphysics or a metaphysis. According to Irigaray, we need to understand an ontology of life rooted in a diaphysis rather than a metaphysics, because a diaphysis would, quote, begin from nature or the real itself, and it would proceed thanks to or means of or through nature or physis rather than beyond it or after it, aka meta. That is just my abstract, so the talk officially starts now. Philosophy, as it's been practiced in the West, is in many ways ill-suited to studying life. While language and metaphors rooted in reproduction and the maternal body have often been appropriated by philosophy, the biological body, especially the cis-female body, is seen as corrupt and decaying, and in this way the event of birth is denigrated. This denigration and dismissal of the materiality of birth is peculiar Because birth, as Fanny Soderbeck reminds us in a Philosophia essay, saying, birth is the one experience that all of life shares. She writes, quote, if male philosophers for millennia have been concerned with death, and if death is the one event those writing about it have yet to experience, birth is perhaps the only experience we all constitutively share insofar as we have all been born. A feminist philosophy of life would include a philosophy of birth, and it would take seriously how things begin. In my work, I argue that the central concepts we associate with the corporeal process of birth that we see in a human frame and register have their origins in something more ancient. And because of this, these more primordial ways of thinking or concepts are necessary and required concept and lens to ground and guide even scientific origins research itself. So in The Sex Which Is Not One, Luce Irigaray argues that certain properties of the vital have been deadened into constancy to give the theoretical machinery of Western philosophy its form. As a result, this theoretical machine and its accompanying logic fundamentally misunderstands and misrepresents life. In a 2018 interview published in Philosophia with Stephen Seeley, Irigaray discusses how her philosophical project is rooted in, quote, what early Greek culture called cosmos. That is, to an organization of the world which does not result from the imposition of a human logos on nature, but results from the logos that nature is. This idea of following an organization of the world which doesn't result from this imposition of a human logos is something that I find really fascinating, and that I think a feminist philosophy of life that also works in, that also we could call a feminist philosophy of birth, should follow or should begin from. In this same 2018 Philosophia interview, Seeley and Irigaray also discuss how sexuate difference could serve as the basis for a new ontology that would no longer be metaphysical insofar as it would begin from nature or the real itself. It instead would be a diaphysics rather than a metaphysics, since it would proceed thanks to, by means of, or through nature, rather than beyond it or after it. For Irigaray, vegetal being is one of the places where we can see this diaphysical logic at work. She writes in the same interview, considering the way of developing a vegetal being, we can observe that living matter moves by itself and provides itself with its own forms. Thus, the becoming of the vegetal world does not require the supply of an external dynamism, even if it needs an appropriate environment for the exercise of its own dynamism. Furthermore, a vegetal being blossoms into new forms without the imposition of external forms on its matter or on it as material. These two aspects already represent a daya and not a metaphysical manner of existing that can teach us how to transform our manner of being and of thinking, as well as one of conceiving of truth and ethics, end quote. Irigaray goes on to say in this interview that, quote, we must reflect on the real nature of our origin. And so what I'm going to turn to in my talk now is experimenting with what this kind of logos that is a diaphysics, where I think I see that at work in origins of life research. And then the kind of origins of life research that I'm focusing on, and even where this image comes from, it's a relatively small strand of origins of life research where I think on my work, I argue, already is thinking in a feminist way, whether the researchers have ever read someone like Irigaray. But it's the metaphysical framework that they're using that I'm about to explain is already thinking outside a logic of death to understand the concept of life. And that in itself brings us closer to thinking about this impossible question. A lot of the most famous origins of life research, I would argue, is actually metaphysical. In other words, they follow a logos that comes after life that is then retroactively projected onto life when trying to understand it. To me, this metaphysics is also a framework of death. This idea of where we get, or the origins of where we think about life through death, perhaps one really useful example is Frankenstein. And so Frankenstein, being a novel written by Mary Shelley in 1818, is a fascinating novel, and she's a wonderful writer. But within the novel, Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, he's interested in, he says himself that to understand the causes of life, we first have to recourse to death. And then what I have on the screen here is the most famous Frankenstein film. It's that 1931 production, where this is a scene where the creature on that sort of operating table is about to be zapped into life. Um, and in the novel, Frankenstein essentially steals parts of corpses from different cemeteries and then sutures them together and then inputs an electrical current to bring this, I prefer to call him a creature rather than a monster, to life. This idea of bringing something to life that is dead, I argue, is implicitly frames a lot of origins of life research, and I'll come to, and I think it actually is rooted in a metaphysics of death. And I think this because actually the most famous origins of life experiment that really kind of started the field off is something that's called the 1952 Stanley Miller experiment. And it was the paper relating to this research was published in Nature, the Nature Journal, which is a really major scientific journal, in 1953. So on the left side of the screen is the diagram drawing that was published in the journal Nature, and in the right side of the screen is the actual sort of experimental apparatus. And basically what this experiment did is that it simulated on the little globe you see on the top right part of the diagram. In that globe, it simulated what was thought to be at the time the ancient ocean of Earth's of the ancient Earth, and also the ancient atmosphere based on what geologists thought the atmosphere may have been made of. And in this experiment, an electrical discharge, or what we could just easily call lightning, was hitting this kind of primordial ocean in this tube for 7 days. And that after the course of 7 days, the precursors to amino acids actually formed. And amino acids are the building blocks of protein, so they are a central part of the processes of life. This experiment ended up causing a lot of cultural fascination, and it kind of jump-started origins of life research, because before this, thinking about this question it was thought that it can't be done scientifically. Like, how are we going to study um, how the origins of cellular life started? And so I think this is a fascinating experiment. It was historically really important. But one sort of issue that this experiment created is I think it's kind of very similar in some ways to this Frankensteinian idea of how do you create life? In other words, through death. Um, and I think that because some scientific researchers also thinking about the origins of life, they argue that this experiment is rooted in what they call an equilibrium way of thinking, or equilibrium thermodynamics. In other words, the system itself is focused on just what do I need to introduce to the system in terms of energy to just create the particular precursors or chemical products that I'm looking for. It completely doesn't center or foreground the question of the milieu in which these chemical precursors are bringing about. One critique of the Stanley Miller experiment, and of a lot of research that then is inspired by it and thinks in the same framework, is that there's this kind of assumption that the origins of cellular life could have happened anywhere on Earth. It could have happened on the ocean surface, it could have happened in a little pond, it could have happened pretty much anywhere. And the research that I think is implicitly feminist in its thinking is research that says actually no, it couldn't just happen anywhere, and they critique the research that's been inspired by the Miller experiment, saying this type of research creates a problem that it has a difficult time solving, which is interesting because that's kind of Irigaray's critique of also Western philosophy. You create the issues that then become a conundrum or a blind spot for you that you yourself can't see. And so the conundrum that is self-created in this types of origins of life research is that because there's a kind of dismissal or non-paying attention to the specific environmental milieu in which life began, because you're just focusing on how do I make those chemical precursors, is that it creates something called the container problem or the membrane problem, and that there's no attention given to like what was the body in which all this was happening, and was that an important part, as important of a part or as crucial as a part as just making those chemical precursors. And so, because a lot of origins of life research actually, in my work, I argue it dismisses or forgets the question of embodiment from its get-go. It's sort of doomed to fail because some scientists joke that once the chemical precursors are created, then this experimental research just says, "Oh yeah, and there was a membrane there that just kind of came out of somewhere." Um, to go back to this image that I had you looking at in the beginning of my talk, my work actually focuses on some strands of origins of life research that I argue that is very geochemical in nature. And in other words, it's really thinking about the environmental milieu in which life may have begun. And one of the things that I find most interesting about it is some of this research theorizes that life began in what they called primordial wombs. And so these little black pores, or dark pores that you see on the screen, they're these pores that are thought to have been created in deep sea hydrothermal vents, a specific kind that I won't get into today, that as water was coming up deep from the Earth's crust into the bottom, into the top of the bottom of the ocean, this is like very deep in the ocean at its floor. The chemical reactions that were created there created these tiny microscopic pores that actually provide a membrane, and therefore, what I argue in my work, a kind of primordial womb that was far from equilibrium, that was never at rest, that created the conditions for cellular life itself to emerge. And so I think this type of research is actually putting into praxis what Irigaray calls potentially what a diaphysicist is rather than a metaphysics of life. Because if we begin by thinking about the question of how life began, by taking its milieu in which it began as seriously as the chemical precursors that we think need to be created, it kind of fundamentally shifts how we think about the question of life itself. And so to close, I would just say that if life in its initial cellular emergence is not a difference in kind from far from equilibrium matter, a gestational space such as like in these microscopic vents that were thought to have been around on the deep in the Earth's ocean billions of years ago, I think this type of work can remind us what life shares, all of life shares at its origins. The debt it owes to an environmental, or what I sometimes call a maternal milieu, that pre-existed and conditioned the possibility of its emergence. In certain geochemically rooted origins of life research that I've highlighted here briefly, the emergence of cellular life becomes a highly probable statistical inevitability rather than an improbable occurrence. This rhetorical transformation signals an epistemological and ontological reframing of the relation between matter and life. At the origins of cellular life, the relation between matter and life shifts from a difference in kind to one of degree. The hydrologics of primordial inorganic wombs engender these rhetorical, epistemological, and ontological shifts, thus offering us a way to fundamentally reorient how we understand the nature of life and its capacity to be engendered by and to further generate difference. Origins research that thinks in tandem with the logic of a womb and a non-anthropocentric concept of the maternal brings us closer to understanding one of the most pressing and enduring and perhaps impossible questions about how we as human beings have been asking about our origins, in how it calls our attention to what concepts have been historically devalued, denigrated, excluded, or even forgotten from both philosophy and science, such as birth, gestation, and embodiment. Feminist philosophy can reorient how we understand the nature of life, including its origins. It can frame and guide radical research about fundamental questions like where do we come from, and what are our origins, and potentially how do we want to live. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're still right on time. That was really interesting.